delighted. I think we're going to have a really wonderful exchange this evening. So thank you so much for the invitation, James.
Pleasure. And I mean, just Zoom etiquette, if you're able, whilst we have a conversation, to mute yourselves during this time, that would be great. And there'll be an opportunity a little bit later to ask questions or to make comments. So, I mean, first of all, could you just tell us a little bit about the background to Hinduism? And I'm conscious that this is a rather complicated sort of question. As I understand it, Hinduism has been described as the eternal religion, Sanatana Dharma, with no beginning. So is it even possible to say when and where it started?
James, may I just step back a little and invite divine inspiration and multiple deities who normally preside over such exchanges to join us, if that's okay.
Yes.
Okay, so we have an invocation which is conventionally used when people of wisdom and learning sit together to explore ideas. And in ancient India, if you can imagine us being seated underneath a tree by the side of a river, the way in which an institution of learning would be created would be with this invocation. So I'll just start with the invocation. It's only a short one, unlike many of our scriptures. It's quite brief and to the point. But if you could bear in mind those people, entities who we call our teachers and gurus, and with a moment of reflective gratitude, the mantra is Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karvavahe Tejasvina Vadhitam Astu Ma Vidvishavahe. Om Shanti 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 Om. So the invocation says, may we be protected and nourished. May we learn from each other in a spirit of trust and harmony and affection. May our efforts together be rewarded with illumination. May there never be harsh words between us. And then we just conclude with the invitation for Shanti, which, although it's translated as peace, the sentiment is more akin to tranquility. So I'm going to sort of remove from your awareness the notion that Shanti means peace. It doesn't, it's tranquility. That captures it so much better. So now, having said that, please accept that as an invitation to engage robustly and with as much determination to tease out wisdom as we go through. Yeah. I would also just add a quick caveat, and that is that we are traditionally acknowledged, and sometimes not so politely, but often quite confidently, as being infidels. And being infidels and non-believers, we happily appropriate that mantle. So please be free to completely ignore and disbelieve anything I say, should you feel more comfortable in that manner. There is absolutely no requirement for, certainly not from my end, for you to believe a word I say. So having said that, I'm now going to turn to your delightful opening question.
Thank you.
We're conducting this exchange in the English language. And as many of you will know, language is a framework. And the framework is limited and defined by the words themselves and the web of ideas behind those words. We have most of our understanding in the Sanskrit language, which has been around for quite some time. And so we have a vast vocabulary. I learned the other day that we have over 400 words for an elephant. We have over 100 different words for water. And so when you have a vast vocabulary, you can possibly hone things down with a greater degree of clarity and precision. And so some of the exchanges that we're going to have, I'm going to be trying to reduce some ideas into the framework that the European Christian languages reside in. We are using a language which defined us as the other. In English, a whole concept of what it was that these crazy brown people over on the other side of the Himalayas was doing. It evolved over a period of time. And so Hinduism is one of those words. In essence, what it actually means is all the stuff that those guys were doing over there. It was an attempt to create a cover-all term. Because there was so much diversity, because there were so many different ways of approaching divinity, a catch-all term was sculpted, and that really has been one that we go along with, but generally sort of tongue-in-cheek. When somebody says, oh yes, you're from the Hindu faith, inside we all have a chuckle and go, oh yes, that's right, that's what we are. But that's not how we define us. Most of the naming in the Sanatan tradition, Sanatan Dharmic tradition, we name not as nouns, but as adjectives. So even Sanatan Dharma, what it actually means, Sanatan means without beginning and without end. And Dharma is one of those words which books have been written about. And as the years go by, and as more and more people from my tradition become very comfortable with the English language, a greater degree of precision and clarity is now beginning to emerge. So Dharma, literally translated, the closest you can come to a translation is that which accommodates everything. So it's that which contains everything. So it's the understanding of that which contains everything without beginning and without end. So as I said, it's more of an adjective as opposed to a noun saying this is what it's called and that's what its label is.
Right.
And if I can just play for a moment, even Hindu names, Satish is a combination of two words, Satya and Ishwar. So a person for whom destiny, or my grandmother as it was in this case, decided the union between Satya, truth, reality, and Ishwar, an understanding or a vision of divinity. For a person for whom reality is equated with divinity, that's the name Satish, that's what it means. So again, it's an adjective, but it's rather, we use it as a label. And that's true for pretty much every name, including, I see we have a participant called Shobha, who also has an adjective for a name. But the tradition, it's slightly different in that all of our efforts, they were not to understand the outside world initially. They were to understand what it is that we are. At some point in time, we open our eyes on and find ourselves in this place. And so the journey then is, okay, well, what am I? If I can understand what I am, maybe I can understand what my purpose is. And so that was the odyssey that the ancestors in this tradition engaged with.
Yeah.
It was a journey which started in Antiquity and prehistory. As far as we've been able to identify and trace back through writings and scriptures, we have a chronology which I'm going to share with you if the technology allows me to.
Yes.
If I click here.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yes, that's good. That's worked.
Excellent.
Wonderful. So there is value to inviting deities to preside over your presentations. So this is something I threw together for a talk I did at Brunel University. And it's a timeline which at the left-hand end, where it says we are here, that's where we start, and then it goes backwards. Now we have a number of scriptures, but the two which are known and probably the most popularly known are the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Now, the ancients had a wonderful habit of recording astronomical occurrences and setting the dates. So such and such a birth occurred when Aries was in its ascendant and Mars was in retrograde or whatever. So they used to identify specific instances. And so in something like the Mahabharata, there are over 300 references which we use to chronologically map exactly when things happened. And so if you look at the timeline, you will see that the Mahabharata actually occurred 5161, I think it was BCE, and the Ramayana 12209 BCE. Now the Ramayana itself, the battle of the Ramayana, it records the Vedas as being ancient and prehistoric even at that time. So the Vedas record geographical scriptures, geographical features. They describe a huge river, the river Saraswati. They describe forests and mountains. And so it's been possible to start to map out and understand when the Vedas were actually written. But the likelihood is that the Vedas date back perhaps a further 6,000 or 7,000 years even. As and when we can define it with the requisite degree of precision, I think we'll start to make declarations. So that's the time frame that we're working with. And that's, we had one advantage in India, and that the mountains separated the civilization to the north and the ocean separated the civilizations to the south. A wonderfully temperate climate. We had, I don't know if many of you have enjoyed mangoes, but there was such a lush array of fruit and vegetables in that tropical zone, so that food was never something which we had to struggle with to the degree that the Europeans and certainly people in the northern climes had to struggle with. And so with too much to eat, a comfortable climate, a relatively secluded civilization, there was the opportunity for humanity to really move forward on the basis of explorations. And that's what our civilization did. So are we old? We're very old. Our orientation is very much more a seeking rather than a believing approach to existence. And so if I can move on to my next slide. Since we've been around for such a long time, here is an example of some of the collection of scriptures which hold the wisdom of this civilization. We have 4 Vedas, and that's 20,337 verses. We have the Mahabharata, which is over 200,000 lines of Sanskrit scripture. It's 1.8 million words. The Ramayana, 24,000 verses, lots of little yoga scriptures of various degrees and detail and esoteric as well as exoteric writings, the Puranas and the Upanishads. And all of them are like giant fingers pointing to the individual. Each and every one of them records a journey that a person engaged in, made some sort of discoveries, decided they needed to record the odyssey that they'd embarked upon and the results, and then left it for posterity. And with so much time and so much freedom, what emerged was a huge explosion of poetry, of creativity, to try and communicate the experiences that our sages and rishis experienced when they turned inwards. And so books like the Mahabharata, it contains one section called the Bhagavad Gita, the divine song. And that is conventionally, when we teach it, it's a book which has 6 dimensions. So at first reading, it's a story. At second reading, it's a commentary on society. At third reading, it's a question about a person, how they should navigate life. When you get to the deeper elements, then there are yoga instructions, which guide you to sit in a particular way, breathe in a particular way. And so at each of those levels, one is normally initiated and then taught and trained, and then one becomes a practitioner. And the same applies with the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. All of them are yoga scriptures as well as itihasa, which is historical records. So we have a vast array to choose from, but the emphasis on each and every one of them is that it's about you. They are pointing to each of us. We're all on the same journey, the journey of self-discovery, of purpose, of how to diminish suffering, how to elevate delight, love, enjoyment, all of those things. And the scriptures that we have are all manuals, pointing the way. Try this, see what happens. try that, here's a clue, etc. So they are a textbook for what the human being is. I presume that most of us recall what Haynes manuals are. Excellent. Well, that's what our ancients tried to do. They tried to produce the human equivalent of the Haynes manuals.
And I mean, just jumping in, that's an awful lot of books. When we go to theological college or seminary, we have, you know, the Bible. Of course, there's multiple commentaries and philosophical reflections on them. Is this sort of list of extraordinary depth and wisdom over many, many years? I mean, how much of it is studied by those training to be priests? How much of it is studied by your, you know, average worshipper at a Hindu temple?
So we have, it's a wonderful question. First, speaking to the professionals amongst us, I would say that the Bhagavad Gita is probably, in this day and age, the core text which is studied. It is a conversation at one level between a loving, humble student who is experiencing depression and his inner voice, the divine guide inside. So at its simplest level, there's that conversation going on. And all of the questions that a person asks when they are in a quandary or a moment of the first chapter of that particular scripture is called Vishad Yoga. Vishad means yoga in a space of deep, dark despair. So the person has come to a crisis in his life. He's in the middle of the battlefield of life and is despairing and knows not what to do next. Complete quandary. He has given up and is slumped. That's how it's described. But the conversation then ensues then is the search for purpose and the search for what do I do next? How do I move beyond where I am? And so that core scripture, it contains 18 chapters, and there are 18 chapters, each of them describing a stage or a perspective of yoga, how to connect with the inner guide. And so that is probably the core scripture that is in most homes. It's the core scripture which is in every temple. It's the core scripture that we probably, you'll find it in hospitals where chaplaincy work is done, or in any places where somebody has an opportunity to reflect and study. That one contains the essence of all of the Vedas. Yeah. So the word Veda means knowledge. When an enlightened being goes inwards, discovers the purpose, is at one with the universe, and then turns outward. The attention goes outwards to study creation. What they found is what they then recorded in the Vedas. So there are 4 books of knowledge about what the human being is and where we fit into the universe. The Gita itself is the manual of how to connect with divinity within in times of toil. The others, the yoga scriptures, they tend to be a bit more esoteric and a bit more specific. They're very much hands-on manuals, sit like this, hold your breath at this point, etc., etc. Yeah. And the Upanishads they were esoteric texts. What Upanishad means is to sit close by. So they're texts which ascetics in forest ashrams wrote for themselves to engage in conversation with each other. And so they're renunciates, they've already made certain decisions. And so those are very much more desiccated, direct, and much, much shorter forms. So we have the whole range. My own personal journey, I'm very familiar with the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. The Ramayana is a core text, which is an incredibly powerful text for guidance in terms of society and how to live. And the yoga scriptures are the mainstay of a personal, mystical, esoteric practice.
Thank you. I will let you go on. You had another slide.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So this, I think, is the core question, which is at the heart of the Hindu Odyssey. It's a Spanish philosopher who said, each day I believe less and less in the social question, the political question, the moral, and all other questions that people have invented. in order that they shall not have to face resolutely the only question that exists, the human question. And that is what our ancients wanted to understand and establish. Now, if I can leap ahead, what they found when they introverted their attention, established themselves in a completely stable, sustainable, introverted state of focused attention, was an experience of undiminished exuberance and bliss. It was a shedding of everything that convinces us that we are individuals. All of a sudden, they connected with a consciousness at the center of their being, which they realized was not physical. And being not physical, it was not bound by any of the mortal chains and trappings. And one aspect of that experience was a sense of connectedness to every other living essence and entity. And that experience is what we call yoga, we call union. And so the journey has always been to turn inwards to the source of our being, to find that one thing which exists at our center, which transcends form, which transcends thought, and reside in that awareness. And that experience was described as being a merging of a drop of consciousness with the ocean of consciousness. And so the essence of the ocean and the essence of the drop is exactly the same. So one of our foundational understandings is that we are drops of divinity, becoming entangled in physicality and mentation, all of which is transient, and with practice, which you can disentangle from and revert backwards to unite with that original experience of being pure consciousness and awareness, loving consciousness. And so our tradition is not about, the essence of it is not a belief-based tradition at all. We are if I was given a free freedom to reconstruct the framework within which we have these dialogues, I would say that the Sanatan tradition is a wisdom tradition and not a belief tradition. In fact, our teachings, certainly in the Upanishads, they reiterate time and time again that thought is transient. We don't hold in high esteem neither the content of thinking nor indeed the processes of thinking. They are variable, they're transient, they're malleable, they're changeable, whereas a human being, each of us, is the end result of 65 million years of labor on behalf of the Mother Earth. That is something to value. Thoughts and ideas and beliefs we hold absolutely no value for comparatively. If there's anything worthy of worship, it's the labor of the Mother Earth to create a space in which we can then appear and enjoy this exploration. So we don't hold beliefs in any great value whatsoever. And that is really at the heart of why we happily embrace the notion of being infidels. We could be embraced in a more affectionate manner than conventionally we have been throughout history, but we're waiting. We're still waiting.
Well, and on that note, the Christian tradition has been rather consumed with, even there's a phrase, "Are you a believer?" And it frames it around a very cognitive sort of way of describing religious faith. And much bloodshed has happened over the centuries about relatively minor disagreements, actually. And what interests me personally about Hinduism is that it's known as a mystical religion, and that it's not attempting to know things about God, but something about experiencing the reality of God in the depths of our souls. And that sort of mystical tradition has also been in the Christian tradition as well. So I think there is something that we share, and on that sort of mystical path?
Well, I'm happy to concede that, since it's the first time we have met, and it'd be wonderful to part as loving friends with more conversations to go. But speaking as a tradition which has been exploring humanity for a very, very long period of time, we would like to share that there is a desperate need for the Abrahamic traditions to take advantage of the fact that at this time in human history, we have easily available to us the gathered wisdom of all of humanity at the end of a phone. And that wisdom, wherever it comes from, is capable of helping us transcend small, petty, parochial, identity-based, both politics, but also fears. It's an extraordinary opportunity we have, but it's going to be a very tough journey for the Abrahamic traditions, because there is so much investment in ensuring that that which has gone before must not be proven to have been false. Now, from our tradition, we look at a human being and a human life as being a fresh start. We are absolutely certain that there is no requirement for any tradition to be preserved from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, because the earth exists to propel us on the journey of self-discovery, and we are created for self-discovery. And so there is no necessity to institutionalize the learning and claim proprietary ownership of any particular body of knowledge. The way our bodies are constructed, they are vehicles for a spiritual journey, whether we like it or not. If we don't engage on that spiritual journey in a manner which is positive, we experience feedback in the form of Karma, i.e. feedback from the universe that actually what you're doing is going to cause either you to suffer or somebody else to suffer. And that's available life in, life out. No other creature on the earth has a requirement to institutionalize learning, because every creature is born, it can fulfill its purpose, it can enjoy creation, loving relationships with offspring and society and community, and then move on. And human beings are exactly the same. And so from our point of view, you need institutions to preserve anti-knowledge. You need institutions to maintain things such as fear, things such as greed, things such as, well, pretty much most of what I think are called the sins. You need institutions to grasp onto those things. And so in our tradition, we have never had a theocracy. India has never, in all of that time, had a theocracy. It's because the natural experience of being a human being for us is it contains everything necessary to become fully self-realized. And so we desperately need the, I often jokingly and without any malice refer to them as the adolescent traditions, to start to become more courageous, to shed everything that hasn't worked, and to move forward and embrace anything that improves the quality of life and diminishes suffering. I was at a conference in Ireland, an interfaith conference, and I was the token Hindu there amongst Muslim clerics and Christian clerics. And it was in Newry, right on the border between the north and south. There is a very passionate engagement with religious tradition there. And after 2 days, I was quite bemused. I couldn't understand the necessity for many of the conversations. I couldn't understand why it was important to know whether it was Isaac or Isaiah, I think it was, who was engaged in the sacrificial lamb process. And they spent 2 days discussing this issue, and I just couldn't understand why. But at the end, they asked me whether there was something I would, as a Hindu, recommend. And in order to accelerate humanity's movement towards a peaceful existence. And speaking as a cleric, my offering was perhaps let's just cancel clerics for a generation, restart and see where we go. But the approach that we have is that we should be fearless in discarding tradition if it doesn't work, and equally courageous in embracing anything that does work, irrespective of source. Everything belongs to humanity, and we should be able to share it without that fear.
That sounds refreshing.
I'm sorry?
That sounds rather refreshing.
Well, I'll be honest, one of the other things I said at that meeting was they said, okay, have a second go, see if there's anything else. And my suggestion was to acknowledge the equal divine status of the feminine form. In our tradition, we have deities which are divine masculine and representatives of divine femininity. And it wasn't until the following morning when I went into the town for lunch that I realized I'd suddenly acquired a very devoted following of all of the ladies who had been present. And the word had got out that there's some crazy Hindus who are saying that women are equally divine as men. And they were very pleased to hear it. But it's self-evident. And it's a truth that we should embrace courageously now. We've been on this little ball of earth for long enough to be able to grow without fear and to transcend these boundaries. I'm going to move on from this slide because time is short, but I just want to say one thing, and that is that this slide shows 4 stages in which our tradition says a person moves. We start at the lowest stage when we have no idea of purpose, but we don't know that we have no idea of purpose. That's the mundane animal human form. Anger, greed, fear, hypocrisy, conceit. And as life is constructed in a manner to move us upwards, we move to confusion, but eventually we start to restore a sense of tranquility and innocence, and that's where we're born. That's the state that we say we are born in, and it's society's fears and greed which pull us down into the lower stages. But if we're born tranquil and innocent, and we then work with people who tell us experiments we can conduct to find what our purpose is, then we move to a state of bliss. And the journey of a yoga practitioner is actually that journey. It's the journey to go upwards. We don't need the lower 2 stages. And for a period of over 10,000 years, India benefited from being able to experiment in this, which is why we have so many books and so much written. We have libraries of experiences. Society in this day and age, sadly, encourages us to do this. Education, rather than elevating us to a sense of bliss at just being a human being, the joy of existence without interruption, if we become confused and dissatisfied, we teach that what's in the West is called teenage rebellion is actually the last stages of a pure, innocent soul saying, I reject violence, greed, all of the things that society is requiring me to accommodate. And then we get to the age of about 40 when we start to say, okay, well, it didn't work out. I'm back on my journey to my teens and our journey back to becoming a wonderful human being, having an extraordinary existence. Yoga is that journey. Yoga, the body of yoga is engaged to do 2 things. One is to heal a fearful, guilty heart and to restore reason, the faculty of pure reasoning to a confused mind. All of the parts of yoga, they work either on the heart or on the head, and it is to restore health and tranquility to both. Now, I suppose we have commandments. One thing that we learned a long time ago was that we live in a world of infinite variables. There are so many changes going on out there that we have absolutely no clue about. And so we learned not to trust the thinking faculty too much, because unless you know all of the factors, all of the relationships, all of the variables, you can't possibly make a decision that's going to give you a valid conclusion. And you probably guessed now, I'm a mathematician. I was a mathematician in my former career. But we realize that the mind can only make decisions on the basis of what it knows, and it can never know everything in a world of infinite change. And if you accept that, and the mind accepts it, what the mind does is it relinquishes its complete confidence in itself. It's a logical understanding. The mind says, oh my God, I can never know everything, therefore I can't compute everything. And if I can't compute everything, yes and no, as outcomes of any decision making, are equally invalid. And so we realize that point by point, moment by moment decision making is not going to help. And so a member of the Dharmic community makes decisions on the basis of Dharmic principles, which have been observed to adhere to certain outcomes. They repeatedly generate beneficial outcomes, either for the individual or indeed for the society and the world. And those Dharmic principles, the first which most people have come across is non-violence. And that is not to be violent either in terms of intellect or in terms of emotion or in terms of physicality. And that's a cornerstone of playing in this playground that we're in. The second is reality. Now that's the word satya. We adhere and revere that which is real. So we happily abandon our concepts and thoughts if we're confronted with something which is experienced and challenges those concepts and thoughts. So we accept reality. The third is knowledge. And for us, knowledge is that which leads to self-realization. Anti-knowledge is knowledge that takes you away from self-realization and union with divinity. Exuberance. We've just talked about Diwali, and I'm sure, and I apologize on behalf of my community for the cascades of fireworks that probably plagued our pets in the vicinities until the early hours. I almost said God-forsaken hours, but there's no such thing. So I apologize on behalf of my community, but that's the exuberance with which we engage with existence. It needs to be ebullient, it needs to be exuberant, colorful. You've seen the holy festivals, the Navratri, where we celebrate the divinity in its feminine forms, whirling dancers, music, noise, food, color, exuberance. And finally, harmony. There is a manner in which all of creation works so that every being experiences a fulfilled existence. And we strive to see that in all of our activities. Now, if we make decisions on those bases, we have understood that a human being is catapulted through existence to a stage where they can be tranquil, where they can be peaceful, where they can actually be harmonious and fully experience bliss. So all of our choices tend to be on the basis of those principles. And they're probably the closest thing that we have when it comes to commandments. But even those, feel free to reject them, because we always say that you're on your own journey, and karma, the feedback you get from the universe, ultimately will guide you. And so we don't have edicts. The Bhagavad Gita, which is the scripture I mentioned, after 18 chapters of lecturing from inner divinity, Arjuna says, okay, I now understand it all. It's marvelous, it's wonderful, I'm a fraction of divinity, but I'm on the battlefield. What do you want me to do? And so even after understanding it all, he asks divinity for guidance, and divinity says, well, go ahead and do whatever you feel you really must do, what you're compelled to do. So even under those circumstances, divinity does not instruct and command. It says you're on a journey, and so you will learn from your journey, try it and see, but now I've told you everything, away you go. And so we apply those principles as far as is possible, and with due regard to the existence of others. One thing that is, you will find, I hope you will find, is that we view as sacrosanct and sacred the conversation that an individual has with their inner voice. It's the most sacred of conversations. And so we wouldn't even interject into that private conversation unless invited, which is why we really struggle with evangelical traditions and conversion and things like that. We feel those as an act of violence. It's an intrusion into a space which we feel is sacred. So that's why we don't have missionary operations, nor indeed do we have a desire to expand. When people are ready, they seek knowledge, and the seeking of knowledge is actually the first qualification for receiving knowledge. So we don't disturb people who are not yet seeking. I'm going to wrap up with a final slide. And this is what Arnold Toynbee said when he discovered those principles, i.e. to navigate life on the basis of non-violence. That he made a statement that in essence, that this last millennia, which had a Western beginning, it needs to have an Indian ending, because the level of consumption in essence is really putting balance, it's introducing imbalance into so many global systems that if we are to ensure survival of humanity, then we need to follow more harmonious ways of interacting with each other and indeed with the planet. This is our vision of what an individual is. When one can identify with the whole of the earth as being me, that's when a person is in a position of understanding and experiencing what a divine being, a human being actually is. So thank you so much for putting up with my flow. 45 minutes have almost gone. James, if I can hand back to you to ask any questions, or indeed to guide me through anything else that we'd like to cover in the session, I'd be really happy to.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just one of them. What's the relationship between the temple and how worship is expressed there, and how faith is expressed at home? And one of the things that I suppose many Christians struggle with is when they visit India, is they see sculptures of deities everywhere, and it's very confusing whether they are worshipped or how does that work?
Excellent. I'm so pleased you asked that question, because I wish somebody had asked that question when the Portuguese and the Brits first arrived on the island, on the land. It would have saved so much hardship. So our focus, let's have a look. Bruce Lee once made a remarkable statement in his movie Enter the Dragon, where he's teaching a student and he says, it's like a finger pointing to the moon. If you focus on the finger, you will miss all of that heavenly glory. So the question is, where do we put attention? Now, for a Hindu, when he's confronted with a deity, the attention should actually be on what is the person experiencing, as opposed to what's the deity. The mind becomes engaged in identifying the deity and trying to chart all of its symbols and understand everything. But if you focus on the individual who is engaged in the practice, what are the ideas that are being imbibed by the individual? What are the thoughts and the feelings that are being experienced by the individual? So if I give you a very crude but very direct understanding of that principle, we worship cows. This is the conventional language. But the reality is, for us, the experience, when you are with a cow, there is an incredible exchange of love and affection that can flow from that creature to a human being. They are the most maternal of all creatures. And it's entirely possible to have an incredibly deep and loving relationship with a creature that can give love without thought and without expectation. So the person who is looking after a cow, in fact, you mentioned depression. One of my standard, shall we say, prescriptions for a person who is chronically depressed is to go to Watford, where they have a dairy which is run along traditional Indian lines, and feed some of the cows there. And the cows are unbelievably affectionate. So for us, the deity or the image or the cow or the object with which we're engaging is not nearly as important as the experience of what happens to us. So we are actually in a two-way relationship, and it's not worship, it's actually a relationship that we're nurturing. I think the other thing is that an image can capture so much more than a book. And when you look at the deities, if you do start to understand what they represent, there's a vast amount of learning which you receive in exactly the same way as you would receive if you were to read a book. So they are not anything nearly as mundane as images representing or trying to create a reduced form of divinity. They're an invitation, they're a journey. And they've been sculpted by people who are immensely clever. If I give you an answer, if I give you a question, who has not seen an image of Ganesha, the elephant god as it's called, without wondering, I wonder what that's about? And so Ganesha is the invitation to wisdom, and wisdom starts with a question. And the first question is, what the hell's going on there? And so the people who sculpted these images, they knew that they were an invitation to a conversation and exchange. There's a whole science behind it. Some of us will gravitate towards Hanuman. Some of us naturally will wonder, what on earth is Kali about? Others will be in awe of Shiva. And each of those is an invitation to an exploration, but the exploration is within ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's a totally different thought to worshipping a god or as an idol.
That's really helpful. And just a relationship between temple and home. Is there a day of the week where you might go to a temple?
Well, they were equally cunning in the construction of the temples. When a person sits in meditation, you enter inwards. The mind is man, and mandir actually means within the mind. So a mandir is a reflection of the sounds, the senses, the sense that one experiences when you go deeper into meditation. So there is a stage in meditation where the mind starts to become so tranquil, and suddenly it feels as though you're in a temple with 1,000,000 bells all ringing at the same time. There is a cacophony of sound somewhere in the silence of your own mind, and you encounter it. There is the sound of a conch shell is heard in the depths of meditation. And so each and every one of the steps that you embark upon when you do an exploration, an odyssey into your own mind, we then reflect them in the structure of a temple. So the temple is also a book which is introducing you to what's going to be experienced on your inner journey. So that's the practitioner's understanding of a temple. But in addition to that, we have all of the traditional forms for capturing a culture and a society's knowledge and enshrining them into processes, rites of passage, opportunities for communion. All of those things are built into the temple as well. Yeah. I think one last thing we have is that a temple is a place which is sanctified by sound. And so the mantras that are articulated in a temple, they create a certain environment that when a person enters into that space, if it's a place where people have been chanting mantras day in and day out, you find that the torrent of thoughts just dissipates and disappears. You become, your mind's vibration or level of agitation actually becomes harmonious with the harmonious environment where mantra are chanted. So that's a little bit of the technical side of what a mandir is. Meditation can occur wherever you wish. The most tranquil of places gives the greatest benefit when it comes to meditation. And so I'm sure you've seen our Hindu ascetics flee to mountain retreats far from the madding crowd, literally. There are two temples for a Hindu. One is the body and one is the world, and everything else is intermediate and in between. So we don't have the notion of a house of God, as it were. There is nowhere where God does not exist.
I feel I could talk for and ask another 200 or 300 questions, but that would deprive everyone else of the opportunity to ask other questions. So,
I feel exactly the same as you did, James. It was a brilliant exposition for me of an area of religious experience, which I've certainly come very close to. And of course, the first thing one would say, James would agree with me, that the mystical experience is identical, really, with that of Christianity. But on the other hand, what drives a civilization and what drives human being is that which involves a degree of competition, possibly even greed. And the present situation of the political situation in India is fascinating in this context, because perhaps for the first time we have really a religious commitment in the government of India, which is Hindu, which hasn't happened since before the Mughals. And here we have very actively in Indian society, and James knows it on the ground, very much as I've certainly known as a foreign correspondent in the past, but now very most vigorously, essentially Western type of energy involved for the advancement of health and all practical things which politicians can offer. And Modi himself is in an extraordinarily difficult position here, in that he has to represent the essence of Hinduism while engaged in the mundane activities which drive the civilization to which the world is bound up at the present period of history.
An hour is not enough. What a wonderful foray into what's happening in India. I think I would contribute one small thing, and do remember that we are reincarnationists. Our experience is that what our essence is transcends physical form. So we have eternity at our disposal. Whatever we don't conclude in this particular lifetime, we'll be back and we'll carry on and we'll get back to that stage of harmony. But I would say one thing, and that is that our tradition is collaborative. It is not competitive. And this is actually a difficulty for our Hindu community in this country. It's taken us a long time to understand that we are in an island whose subconscious is actually based upon establishing a reality on the basis of adversarial engagement. We have a legal system which is adversarial. We have a commercial system which is adversarial. We have a religious environment which is adversarial and competitive. And so it's taken us almost 3 generations to understand that this society actually appreciates the person who goes out, takes a knife, kills their bear, skins it, brings it back and say, hey, I've brought back the... I'm mixing metaphors. I almost said I've brought back the bacon, and then I thought, this is a metaphor that's going totally the wrong direction. But we have a very long-term view, and Modi is the first manifestation whereby a dharmic perspective of a collaborative humanity is entering the political and the resource area of India. It's going to be an extraordinary experiment, but I have no doubts whatsoever that his vision of humanity is the vision of humanity that I shared with you. But he can't reveal that because it's too early just yet. India has a lot of decolonization to go through yet. It has to connect confidently with the vision that has been propelling it for over 10,000 years. And that vision is not a vision which is threatening to anybody at all.
Thank you. Other questions? Lindsay.
Yeah, one of the earliest Vedic hymns describes, if I remember correctly, in the most beautiful, almost metaphysical way, like the opening of the Gospel of John, this extraordinary light. I just wondered if you could say something about there's so much literature that you couldn't mention everything, but those most beautiful early Vedic hymns, the first ones, and that particular one, the creation.
My goodness. Well, where do we start with that? The notion of light as being our essence pervades all of the scriptures. And my first sounds when I was in our tradition, the first sound that we hear is what's commonly, actually mistakenly called the Gayatri Mantra. And that's from the Vedas. It's an invocation. It's an invitation to the light, to enter me to such a degree, to suffuse my being with so much light that the light within and the light without, the boundary dissolves to such a degree that I just unite as a being of light. So our essence understands that the first manifestation of divinity, which we can connect with from a sensory basis, is light. And then out of that light come all of the variety of colors and the multiplicity of creation as we perceive it with these eyes. So our journey backwards is that as we disengage from every one of the senses, and then we disengage with every one of the mental areas, what happens is that light is going backwards, and our attention becomes so focused that it becomes a point of conscious light. And when that happens, there is no interruption to it. when you've experienced even a glimpse of it, one of the most magical things that happens is that every element of your own being that you identify and fully understand, you then fully identify and understand it in every other human being. When you navigate the craziness of your thinking apparatus, suddenly you develop an affinity to the challenges that everybody else is going through, because we've all got this crazy apparatus. So the journey inwards to that essence which is light, not only does it teach you about what you are, but it teaches you about what everybody else is. The essence is exactly the same, and it is loving, aware light. Of that there is no dispute or difference of opinion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question, Lindsay. That was a lovely question. And Tom, not wanting to be accused of discrimination, thank you so much for your introduction and those questions as well.
I think Anna has a question here.
Oh, so many questions. One, you thank you for a wonderful talk. You have mentioned the divinity and divinities, and I wonder what that means in Hinduism.
So we have a statement which is a core statement from the Vedas, which says Ekam Satya Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Ekam means singular. Satya is the ultimate reality. That there is the ultimate reality is singular. But wise people refer to it by many names. And so we also have a degree of humility in acknowledging that we are not the most evolved being and species on this earth. That between us, there are levels of beings which are more than us, but less than the ultimate reality. They still have form, they still have intent, they still have purpose, they still have their journey to complete. And so there is us here at the last stage between beings who exist in material form and then beings who can exist without material form. And so between us and the ultimate reality, there are still many stages to go through. And so we acknowledge their existence and revere and seek their blessings as our elders, as beings who have moved further in the journey than we have yet gone ourselves. And those beings are without physical form, and so they are without gender. They are without all of the little flags that we use to differentiate between us, and yet they are closer to divinity than we are. So we accept them as divinities.
Thank you so much. That also ties in with something I was wondering about evolution. I had something extraordinary today on the radio that the Russians took lichen from rock and sent it to the moon and back, and all the radiation didn't completely destroy the biology in the lichen. And are we as evolved from that through all the rest of biology to be considered as the ultimate? It seems to me we are part of a program of transformation materially as animals as well as spiritually. Life
is enjoying itself. I view, if I can put this into words, I view the energy of life like electricity. When electricity flows into a toaster, it experiences the joys that a toaster experiences because of its toaster form. When it flows into a laser display on the Thames, it's a totally different but exuberant experience of existence. And life is the same. It's flowing everywhere. There is nowhere where we can actually detach ourselves from life. And it's cleverer than we are. It has a design. And the sooner we learn to go along with that design, the greater this journey is. We enjoy it, and we enjoy the joy of being connected to every other living being. It's an amazing experience that we're in. It's only when we become trapped by our sense of we're small, that we're little flesh body suits and all the rest of it, that we become limited and fearful. In the absence of that, we are divinity on a journey of self-discovery. Divinity is playing hide and seek. It had eternity at its disposal and decided, I'm going to play the ultimate game of hide and seek, and got lost within its own creation. What a joyful game.
Thank you.
Satish, I think I've come to the end of our time, but it feels that, as I say, that it's raised many more questions and interesting.
I hope I have disturbed everybody to such a degree, but they're disturbed with a smile on their face, thinking, I have no idea what went on in that hour, but it was good fun, and that would be a big step forward for all of us.
No, it was absolutely intriguing and wonderful to have someone who can articulate something of your faith and tradition. Really, really super helpful. Is there sort of an ending elements that you, just as you begun, is there an ending you could close with?
Indeed, indeed. So again, we acknowledge the debt that we have to those visionaries who have taught us on our journey, our parents, right the way through to our gurus, and holding them in mind. Om Akhandamandalakaram Vyaptam Yen Characharam Tadpadam Darshitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Om Bhur Bhuvasvaha Om Tatsavitur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yona Prachodayat. Om. So the first shloka was asking for that which flows in all of creation like a fragrance, placing my head at its feet. I thanked it on behalf of all of us for the opportunity of learning and receiving wisdom. The second mantra is the Gayatri, in which Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha Tat Savitur Varenyam, that which appears first as radiance, as effulgence in this world, Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi, fill me with radiance to such a degree that that which separates me from everything else dissolves, and that only light remains. Dhiyo yo naha prachodayat, and let there be no more talk of you and I. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. James, I'd just like to thank you for reaching out with the courage and the courtesy. It made it impossible for me to say no. I wanted to participate. I could see that there was a real, genuine contribution being made at a time when we run the risk of becoming insular, small and fearful.
Yeah.
And so I recognize the love and the affection with which the invitation was made. And so thank you so much for that, James.
Thank you so much.
If I could conclude with an apology, if I have said anything which has caused anybody to feel troubled or discomforted, please recognize that I don't really care. It wasn't intended to be in any way unpleasant. And I hope that everybody took it as a bit of mischievous play that I was engaging in. So please, my apologies for any offense given. It was entirely intentional.
Not at all. We loved every minute. It was intriguing and wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us.
Namaskar ji. And everybody stay safe.